When Dylan, Rico, and I were 9 years old, two sixth-grade boys strode into the school bathroom and plunged the room into darkness. The three of us, and what seemed like half the school, waited outside with our breath held in anticipation. Strangely, it felt as though everyone secretly wished for things to go wrong. These two kids were engaged in a game that still astounds me with its absurdity. They were meant to stand before a mirror in total darkness and recite a mysterious incantation 3 times. According to their plan, if everything went as intended, a sinister force from another realm would emerge through the glass. I never quite understood what they hoped to accomplish, and naturally, the game never worked. I later discovered that this ritual went by many names: Bloody Mary, the Candyman, but at our school it was known as Bonebreaker. Legend had it that over 300 years ago, a pirate named Grimshaw washed ashore in our Bayford Harbor town after committing unspeakable acts. The townspeople condemned him to a gruesome death by skinning, flaying him alive in the square, and God, how he screamed. Even after every scrap of skin was stripped away, his screams persisted. Uncertain how to proceed, since no one had ever survived an entire flaying, they began removing his muscles, fat, cartilage, tendons, and even his guts, leaving only his bones. Even when reduced to a bare skeleton, Grimshaw continued to shriek, unnerving the mob so much that he eventually managed to escape. He fled into the vast 100-acre forest at the edge of our town, and it was said that if you wandered those woods alone at night, you might still hear his agonized cries and vengeful pursuit. Admittedly, it's an unbelievable tale. Our town never actually skinned anyone alive, and logically, no one could scream with their throat torn out, but to a grade schooler, it was perfectly terrifying. That's why an eerie hush fell over the students outside when the two boys began their seance in the bathroom. They chanted, "Bonebreaker, bonebreaker, 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 bonebreaker," until the bathroom fell silent. A collective wave of relief washed over us as we prepared ourselves for disappointment. But then, the most spine-chilling scream I'd ever heard reverberated through the halls from inside the bathroom. It was clear something had gone horribly wrong. The crowd exploded into chaos, and the screams from within grew louder, more desperate, and filled with agony. Before long, everyone wanted to run as far away as possible. I'm not sure anyone really knew what the ritual was supposed to do if it succeeded, but by then we were in too deep. Bonebreaker could burst through that door at any second, teeth bared in a bony snarl, ready to tear our skin away. There are moments in life that you simply never forget. I still remember the crunch of my first car when it slammed into a highway wall at 50 miles per hour. I'll never forget the look on my wife's face when she heard the news of her mother's death. And until I die, I will remember those two boys scrambling from the bathroom, clothes in tatters, bodies marked by deep bleeding gashes much like Grimshaw's, and still screaming. Music. "Let's go, you jagoffs!" someone shouted. I stumbled through thick brush, struggling to keep pace. Dylan was faster than us. He would grow up to be an excellent distance runner, and he was growing impatient. We had been at least half a mile away from the frontier road that marked our town's edge. The last person we'd seen was old Hank Wilcox, who waved at us from his porch about 30 minutes earlier. By that time, grass and bushes reached our waists, many of them prickly. Poor Rico had chosen to wear shorts on this adventure, and I could see a few drops of blood already trailing down his leg. 100 yards ahead lay our destination for the day, the forest. I pressed forward to catch up with Rico, murmuring, "Come on, the sooner we get there, the sooner we can head back." "This is man," Rico panted. We've been walking for 2 hours straight. None of us would be old enough to drive for another 7 years, so we had no choice but to keep on foot. We practically staggered into Dylan, who was waiting at the forest's edge. "God, you guys are so slow," he said with a mischievous grin. Dylan was a nice guy, but he couldn't stand being second best at anything. If you told him it only took you 15 minutes to finish your homework, Dylan would redo his just to boast that he was faster. Rico, on the other hand, was a slower child. Truthfully, I could have kept up with Dylan, but I was closer to Rico and didn't want to hurt his feelings. His father was a hulking man who nearly became a pro baseball player, and he had named his son after a great ball player, expecting him to follow in his footsteps. Yet Rico suffered from asthma and was about as athletic as a lump of clay. I couldn't help but feel sorry for him as I watched him pull his inhaler from his pocket. He always felt like a disappointment to his old man. So there we stood at the very edge of the forest, on the brink of legend. "This is it," Dylan declared, hands on his hips as he surveyed the imposing woods. "Look, Bonebreaker is in there." "Nah, he isn't," Rico gasped. "How would he even move without muscles? Get bent, man." With a dismissive wave, Dylan insisted, "I want to see it for myself." And with that, he stepped boldly into the shadows. I exchanged a reluctant glance with Rico. Though neither of us wanted to follow, we trailed him nonetheless. Of course, none of us really expected to encounter Bonebreaker. The day after the bathroom incident, the principal visited every classroom to explain that the blood on those boys was nothing more than an elaborate prank. I thought the prank was brilliantly executed, and so did Rico. But when the principal came to our classroom, Dylan looked downright dejected. While the rest of us were thrilled by the stunt, Dylan had been genuinely excited. There was something exhilarating about being part of it. And I suppose that's what drove Rico and me into the woods 2 months later, struggling to keep up with Dylan on his unyielding quest for a scare. The kid was a true adrenaline junkie, and with summer just beginning, he craved adventure. It fell to his 2 best friends to help him find one. None of us actually believed in Bonebreaker, yet the moment I stepped into that dank, suffocating forest, I began to believe a little more. I glanced at Rico, and despite the rapidly darkening sky, I could see on his face that he wasn't dismissing the chance of meeting Bonebreaker either. Even though Dylan was barely 50 feet ahead, he was nearly swallowed up by the thick foliage. There was no proper path, only wild, untamed growth, boulders to climb over and roots to trip on. Even the leaves, usually a vibrant green, wore a gray tint in the dim light. No wonder everyone in town avoided this place. I looked up nervously at the thick canopy through which the sun barely shone. "How are we going to find our way back?" Rico asked, and I glanced over my shoulder. We had only been in the forest for a couple of minutes, yet the outside world already felt like a distant memory. I wondered just how far Dylan intended to push this adventure. "Let's catch up. We need to stay together," I urged, picking up the pace. Rico followed reluctantly, and by the time we reached Dylan, he was practically at the end of his rope. "Dude, it's creepy in here. Can you slow down for a minute?" Dylan snapped. Then he stopped abruptly. There were no chirping birds, no crickets, only our heavy breathing and the crunch of our footsteps in the eerie silence. We were completely alone, wrapped in a pall of gray that made the atmosphere almost tangible. Maybe we hadn't thought this through at all, I reasoned, trying to be diplomatic with Dylan. There's nobody out here, not Bonebreaker, not anyone else. If we get lost, there'll be no one to help. "Do you really want to spend the whole night here? Maybe even longer?" he challenged. Dylan insisted. All we have to do is retrace our steps, and we'll be out by morning. I'll slow down if Bonebreaker comes for you, he added, glancing pointedly at Rico. I got your back. I'm not scared, Rico declared as he marched ahead, with Dylan smiling and following. I said nothing, but in hindsight, I should have. I should have told them to turn back, that something was off, that we weren't meant to be here. I should have mentioned that despite our apparent solitude, I felt as if we were being watched. But I kept my eyes on the ground, unwilling to appear like a coward, a label no 9-year-old wants. After what seemed like another hour, I became more frightened of dying in that forest than of earning my friend's disapproval. I looked at Dylan and said, "We've gone far enough," hoping I sounded braver than I felt. We weren't supposed to be out here anyway. If we don't get back before dark, we're really in trouble, I continued. Dylan paused, considering my argument, almost ready to abandon our adventure. Then his eye caught something in the distance. "What the hell is that?" he muttered as he strode past me. I turned around and saw a tangle of jet black branches far off in the distance. "Come on," I urged Rico, who looked nearly delirious from exhaustion. A minute later, the three of us stood before a tree unlike any we'd ever seen. In stark contrast to the towering oaks around us, this tree was short, frail, and withered. It bore no leaves, an utterly unthinkable sight, and its bark was an all-consuming black. I recalled from a science class that black isn't truly a color, but a total absorption of light. Yet if I hadn't seen this tree, I never would have fully grasped that idea. While all the other trees teemed with life, this one seemed to suck it right out, and even the air about it felt darker. "Holy," Rico whispered, almost reverently. Dylan let out a low whistle in agreement. "See this man?" he asked. I remained silent, straining to listen for that strange sound again. "What are you doing?" Rico inquired of Dylan, who simply shook his head and whispered, "Shh." I tapped my ear, trying to detect the sound once more, but after a few tense seconds, it vanished. "I don't hear anything, man," Dylan giggled. "You must be losing your marbles," Rico teased, relieved he wasn't the butt of the joke. But I was too captivated by the otherworldly tree. I felt an irresistible urge to both investigate it and run away. We all stared at the tree for a moment until Rico finally broke the silence. "I dare you to touch it," he challenged. Immediately, Dylan's eyes lit up. This was what he'd come out here for. I, however, grew increasingly fearful of that tree. With every passing second near it, something about its presence felt malicious. I recalled that eerie sound once more, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I cringed as Dylan advanced toward the tree, but I dared not say a word. He was determined to touch it, no matter what. Dylan extended his hand and pressed his palm against the tree's surface, and for a moment nothing happened. Rico, out of breath, even looked relieved, and Dylan's expression softened. I began to relax just a bit and muttered, "Have fun, dummy." Then I heard it again, a heavy, angry breathing nearby. "Do you guys hear that?" I asked, panic edging into my voice. Dylan paused and strained his ears, but soon the breathing was gone. "I did hear breathing," I admitted sheepishly. "I think someone else is here," another voice seemed to say. Yeah, Dylan laughed, then pulled out a small pocket knife and handed it to me. "Carve your name in the tree. I dare you." I felt the weight of the dare as though a gun were pressed to my hand. The pressure of dares among 9-year-olds is immense. I gritted my teeth, took a deep breath, and stepped toward the tree. Up close, the tree looked even stranger. Its edges appeared fuzzy, like a blurred photograph. A single thought surged through me. I shouldn't be here. I threw a pleading glance at Rico, who tried to help me out. "Hey, it's getting dark," he said, but Dylan hushed him. His eyes were fixed on me. He had come out for an adventure and wasn't about to leave without one. Reluctantly, I raised my arm, remembering my earlier promise to Rico, and pressed the knife against the tree's almost porcelain surface. That's when I heard it again, breathing right in my ear. I whirled around and bolted, sprinting past Dylan and Rico as if fleeing for my life. I barely registered their shouts calling my name as I ran. I only stopped when I was nearly half a mile from the tree. By then, Dylan was laughing as he finally caught up with me, and even Rico sported an amused grin. As I've said before, there's a shame a 9-year-old can never shake. After 2 weeks of relentless teasing, yes, truly relentless if you knew Dylan, I decided to take drastic measures. That's how I ended up alone in the middle of the night at the forest's edge, armed only with a flashlight and a thin jacket. The sky was shrouded in clouds lit only by a partially hidden full moon, and a thin mist hung in the air. It was a dark, not so stormy night. Over the years, I've noticed that bad decisions tend to come easier when I should be asleep. That night, I first understood that truth. Standing on the brink of disaster with adrenaline coursing through every vein, I felt not fear but a strange aliveness. I calmly stepped into the shadows, having no idea how I'd locate the tree again or care about the oppressive silence of the forest. In hindsight, that silence should have made me turn back, but I refused to be known as a coward. With adrenaline high and my inhibitions low, I gradually realized that I was being led by something unknown. As I paused to reorient myself, I recognized that I had no clue where I was, though I was convinced I should head southwest. It felt as if an unseen force was guiding me, a sensation that made me hesitate. I could have turned back with no one the wiser, but I couldn't bear the thought of admitting defeat to my friends. Images of Dylan and Rico's taunting faces spurred me on, even as I sensed that something wanted me there. The final 15 minutes of that walk were excruciating, but eventually I came upon the tree, nearly invisible in the dead of night. A profound dread, the deepest I had ever known, filled me as I approached. Then the breathing resumed, encircling me, and the murmurs grew into indistinct whispers that made my body shake with terror. I tried to convince myself I could handle it. I was only imagining things. I pulled out my pocket knife and stared at the tree with fierce determination, telling myself, "Run there, carve, then run back." I was fast. Not as fast as Dylan, but fast enough, I believed, to outrun whatever might pursue me. I took a deep breath. It was now or never. Before I reached the tree, my ankles caught on something, and I crashed to the ground, my hands instinctively outstretched to break the fall. The knife slipped from my grasp, its blade slicing deeply across my palm. The pain was immediate and blinding. I curled up, clutching my injured hand, when the whispers around me grew louder. I scrambled to my feet, blinking away tears, and grabbed the knife once more. Using my bloodied hand for support, I pressed it against the tree and began to carve. The wood yielded as if it were soft fruit, and I was done in mere seconds, too terrified to admire my handiwork. I turned to run, but my bleeding hand clung to the tree as though the bark itself were sucking the blood from me. I tried to free it gently, but the pain was unbearable. The whispers around me transformed into mocking laughter, initially quiet, then louder, as if a woman were hysterically cackling right beside my ear. Ignoring the searing pain, I yanked my hand away, ripping a huge chunk of flesh from my palm. I howled in agony and turned to flee, expecting something to stop me. But I didn't care about the consequences anymore. All that mattered was escaping as far from that cursed tree and the haunted forest as possible. Fortunately, whatever else lurked in the woods let me go. Blood dripped from my hand as I ran through the trees, only stopping to tear off my shirt and wrap it tightly around my wound, an instinctive act to keep my blood inside. I wept without knowing it until I finally reached the forest's edge. Only when I emerged into a vast open field at the outskirts of town did I allow myself a moment to turn back and catch my breath. I even managed a wry smile and a middle finger from my uninjured hand at the forest that had held me captive. Later that night at home, my father heard me fumbling around and came downstairs, concerned by the state of my mangled hand. He promptly disinfected and bandaged it, and when I was no longer in immediate danger, he demanded to know exactly what had happened. I hadn't had time to fabricate an excuse, so I told him everything, the whole truth from Bonebreaker onward. At first, his face turned angry, and then pale with terror as I recounted the events. I fully expected to be grounded, or even beaten for my honesty, but my father listened intently without interruption, though he groaned in despair when I mentioned the black tree. After a long silence, he finally spoke in a quiet, measured tone. "Son, you didn't know you couldn't have." I was taken aback by his unfinished sentence, unsure of what he meant. He continued slowly. "That tree, you never really understood it, did you? My father had lived in this town his entire life, as had his father before him, and when I was very young, maybe even your age, my grandfather told me a story about that tree." "Was that the tree in the story?" I asked, suddenly fascinated. He nodded and said, "Your Bonebreaker tale is nonsense, as you know, but it's loosely based on real events. Have you ever heard of the witch trials?" I shook my head. He explained slowly. "Long ago, before America was even a country, the people here were far less reasonable. They were superstitious and terrified of many trivial things, none more so than witchcraft. It's tragic to think about now, but in those days, many local women were executed on mere suspicions of witchcraft." "But witches aren't real," I interrupted. "For the most part, you're right," he conceded. "Often, a woman was labeled a witch simply because she was disliked. Most of those executed had no trace of magic in their blood. But do you believe some of them might have had real power?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "One of the women killed in this town was named Isabella Wolfe. I've read her journal entries myself. You can find them at the library," he added. "They said she was the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen, yet even the most logical folks in town regarded her as evil." "Why?" I inquired. "Because she was different," he said. "She arrived from out of town one day, and shortly afterward, inexplicable events began to occur. People fell ill, crops withered overnight, and even snakes, venomous ones that wouldn't normally be here, appeared throughout the town. In response, the townspeople executed her. They also killed many other women for far less. In Salem, where justice was scant and trials unheard of, the mob decided guilt on its own." Eventually, the people grew so frightened of Isabella that they dragged her into the woods and hanged her from a tree. I gasped, realizing exactly which tree Isabella Wolf had been hung from. Before dropping her, she locked eyes with her executioner. He later recorded in his journal that she was so beautiful he could barely bring himself to carry out his task, confessing that he wished he could follow her into hell. A week later, overcome with guilt, he took his own life at that very tree. Before being hanged, Isabella had told them, "I could stop you if I wished." When the executioner asked why she wouldn't, she simply smiled and replied, "I have a better idea." He dropped her, but she did not die. Her neck was broken, yet she hung there, eyes wide open, calmly staring at the townspeople with a disquieting smile. They tried to lift her up, only to drop her again, as the rope scraped off much of her skin. But still she did not die, only smiled. Her calm defiance terrified the onlookers so much that eventually they left her hanging overnight. When morning came, she was gone, as was the rope. All that remained was the tree, black, withered, and filled with an aura of pure malevolence. Music. My dad made me swear not to tell Dylan and Rico any of this, he had warned, insisting that nothing would happen if we kept quiet. But he refused to say more. And though I tried to honor his wishes, I couldn't keep the tale to myself. Dylan, ever eager for an adventure, was captivated by my story, while Rico, who also felt partly responsible for my ordeal, was more subdued. Still, both agreed to help me research the death of Isabella Wolf at the library. By the end of summer, the three of us were poring over books in the oldest building in town, one filled with the history of our community. Daphne Gray, the assistant librarian, was strikingly pretty and delighted in showing children around her library. It was a slow day, so she was more than happy to help. "What are you looking for?" she asked, eyeing the stack of photocopies on our table. "We're searching for information on the witch trials," I explained. "A woman named Isabella Wolf was executed long ago, and we've heard some wild stories about it," I continued. A flicker of recognition and perhaps fear crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. Even though the subject was macabre, her love of teaching shone through as she smiled and said, "Let's get to work." We were grateful for her assistance. Though her handwriting was almost illegible and her spelling peculiar, Daphne Gray was determined to help us. It wasn't long before she herself became somewhat ensnared in the mystery surrounding that accursed tree. We didn't uncover every detail, only fragments, but it was enough to piece together the secrets it held. Apparently, Isabella Wolf's executioner wasn't the only one to meet his end at that tree. After his body was discovered at its base, a string of suicides and hangings followed. The prevailing sentiment was that the men who took their own lives on that tree were ordinary, upstanding citizens. The shock and sorrow of the townspeople seeped through the pages of documents we read. At one point, Caroline Drake, wife of the late Marcus Drake, wrote of her husband's final days, how he'd grown strangely distant, as though possessed by a woman more beautiful than she. We also learned that when the executioner's body was found, his wrists were cut, yet there was no trace of blood. A superstitious town leader even speculated that vampires were sucking his blood under the cover of night. I dismissed that theory as unlikely, though I subconsciously ran my fingers over my bandaged hand. Eventually, Daphne Gray realized that discussing suicide with 9-year-olds wasn't ideal and bid us farewell. But before she left, she turned back with a parting message. "History is an amazing thing, kids. Never lose your passion for it, or else the past will be forgotten. And that tree is still out there, you know, I replied, recalling its terror. We all knew that Dylan and Rico had sworn never to return to the forest. Yet the horrors began anew one chilly September night, just weeks after school resumed. Old Hank Wilcox, always greeting us with a smile and wave, suddenly vanished and wasn't seen for 3 days. My father theorized that he had simply fallen and gotten stuck somewhere out of sight. "Do you really think so?" I asked, picturing poor Hank suspended from that cursed tree. "That's one way to put it," my father answered, though he looked troubled. When Hank was finally found, the town was in shock. He was the last person anyone expected to take his own life. Something was clearly amiss, and the townspeople sensed it. The night after Hank's discovery, Clint Redding got out of bed and told his wife he'd be right back. She awoke around 4 in the morning to find 2 snakes slithering through her sheets and screamed in terror. Of course, her husband never returned because he wasn't there. I won't say where he ended up, but by that point the town was in a state of panic. A meeting was held, and surprisingly many adults attended. Even my dad went. At the meeting, there was little discussion of the supernatural. The natural explanation for the suicide spree would have been ridiculed by kids, but we knew the truth. At the meeting, a recent college graduate named Eddie Marshall volunteered to keep watch at the tree during the night, ensuring no one else fell prey to its curse. It seemed like a good idea to everyone involved, until the very next morning when Jeremy Roberts and Vince Collins were found hanging from the same limb as Eddie Marshall. The following night, there was a knock on our door. My father answered and then called for me, his face grave. It was Daphne Gray, the beautiful librarian who had recently been widowed. If any woman in town could seduce her husband away from Isabella Wolfe, it would have been her, without question. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke to me in desperation from the doorway. "You knew," she sobbed. "You knew this was going to happen again. How did you know?" My father gently nudged her aside and said, "Come in, Daphne. I'll explain everything." He motioned for me to follow, indicating that this conversation wasn't meant for children, or perhaps not for either of us, given her loss. He hoped that the 2 of them could find comfort in each other, and I secretly wished for that too, though fate had other plans. For one blessed week, the string of suicides ceased. People began to breathe a little easier, and the town slowly returned to a semblance of normality. Despite an overwhelming sense of guilt, I even felt somewhat normal for a while. Then, near the end of my fall break, a sound awoke me from sleep. My father had been stumbling about in the dark, knocking something over, a round object that clattered on the floor. I wasn't sure what it was, but it made a rolling sound, and my father didn't bother to pick it up. I rubbed my eyes, wondering what he was doing. I peered at my partially open bedroom door, just ajar enough to let in slivers of moonlight that revealed the dark hallway beyond. The faint light from my window barely illuminated the dancing shadows. I began to hear indistinct whispers. I tried to sit up, but my body felt paralyzed, as though I were bound to the bed. I lay there as the whispers grew louder, a soft command, "Come with me." Then I heard footsteps, one pair, unmistakably my father's heavy boots, in the darkness. I wondered who he was talking to, who was whispering, but before I could speculate further, a shadow appeared on the hallway floor. I could do nothing but watch in horror as the silhouette of a woman stepped in front of my door. The feeble moonlight revealed her overwhelming beauty, yet her aura exuded an almost palpable evil. Her head was tilted unnaturally on her neck, a sight both disturbing and mesmerizing. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. She smiled cruelly, raised her fingers to her lips, and silently walked down the hall. Footsteps followed her. My father continued down the corridor without even glancing at my door, clutching a length of rope in his hand. Tears streamed down my face as I stood powerless, watching in horror. I could only watch as my father followed the haunting figure, Isabella Wolf, into the forest. My father was the last one seen entering that cursed wood. When he was eventually discovered, I told the authorities everything, and though they were skeptical, or pretended to be, it felt better to be safe than sorry. They even asked if I wanted to watch, but I firmly declined. Later that day, 6 brave men set out to the forest's edge, armed with axes, picks, and shovels. They reached the black tree and hacked it limb by limb. They dug out its roots and carried the entire accursed thing away. That night, they burned every last piece of it in an old industrial furnace, hoping to end the terror Isabella Wolf had cast upon our port town, or so I thought. Now, as a grown man with a wife and children of my own, I took them on a visit to the town of my youth. I showed them the baseball field where I once played, the school I attended, and even the forest's edge where Dylan, Rico, and I hunted for a silly myth rooted in a grim reality. I never told them the real story of how my old man died, and I don't intend to. As I always say, there's some shame that no 9-year-old can ever overcome. 6 men died in this town years ago, and if you had to pinpoint a responsible party, it would probably be me. That's why last night I ventured back into the woods. I needed to see that the cursed tree was gone to gain closure. It felt like riding a bike after a long time. I knew the way. I felt the path. When I reached the spot where my father and so many others met their end, I knew I was standing before true evil. I was baptized in fear at that very spot. Emerging from the cold, unforgiving earth was a small sapling, a fragile little tree, less than a foot tall, as black as a raven's wing.